Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Leon Smith. I'm the Executive Director here at Citizens for Juvenile Justice, and we're really thankful that you're joining us today for the launch of our latest report, Schools Out, Massachusetts Youth and Adult Correctional Systems Denied Education. So we're going to hear a presentation about the findings and recommendations of this report today, followed by a distinguished panel of professionals who will explore the importance of education for this population and how imperative it is for us to improve our current system here in Massachusetts. The lack of educational access for school-age young people in Massachusetts adult correctional systems is very concerning. Education is the key to unlocking the boundless potential of our young people and ensuring that their journey into a healthy and productive adulthood happens. When we deprive young people of the services and supports that they need to access and complete their educational journey, we delay their ability to reach essential milestones like high school graduation that are core building blocks for personal and financial stability in adulthood. And unlike their 18 to 20-year-old peers in the juvenile system, young adults transitioning into adulthood inside our adult correctional facilities face substantial barriers to accessing the educational instruction and services that they are legally entitled to. In our report, we set forth this systemic failure to educate this population of young people who, despite their incarceration, still have a legal right to education. And we also set forth solutions that can move our Commonwealth forward on this issue. Before we get into it, I'm going to do some housekeeping. We're going to have people who aren't presenting muted to avoid any background noise. We're going to ask you all to please hold your questions until the end of the presentation and to avoid using the chat to submit questions during the presentation. We have a dedicated portion of today's event for question and answer. We've also invited members of the press today, so portions of this discussion may be quoted in the media. We're also going to be recording this session, and it will be available on our website at cfjj.org, where you can also download a full copy of the report. So with all that being said, and without further delay, I will turn this over to our report's author, Josh Nankoff, CFJJ's Director of Strategic Initiatives, for his presentation. Josh?
Thanks so much, Leon. It's a pleasure to be here with people, and I'm pleased to present the findings of today's report, Schools Out, Massachusetts Youth in Adult Correctional Systems Denied Education. Next slide. Briefly, to give you an overview, we're going to quickly talk about the research question, methodology, and a little on the legal obligations for young people who are incarcerated in their education. There are 6 key findings and some recommendations. And as of now, the report is live at cfjj.org/schools-out. So I encourage you to go check it out, download a copy. Spoiler alert, our key finding shows that hundreds of young people age 18 to 21 every year, young people who have IEPs in place, that's individualized educational programs. These are people who have been identified as requiring special education services, who are incarcerated in the adult system in Massachusetts at either houses of corrections or the Department of Corrections, do not receive the special education services to which they have a right. We're going to talk today about why this happens. We're also going to talk today about some recommendations that can help improve this situation. So broadly, the research question asks, how do the educational approaches and outcomes for young people age 18 to 21 who are incarcerated in Massachusetts, especially those identified as needing special education services, compare between the juvenile system, the juvenile justice system, in this case, those who are at DYS, the Department of Youth Services, and the adult correctional facilities, both the county level houses of correction and the state level Department of Corrections. The basis for this report and the findings of this report come from public records requests and the responses that were sent to County House of Corrections, the DOC, as well as the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, DESE, and the Collaborative for Educational Services, CES, to understand both policy, practice, and data. I'll go into more detail about some of these acronyms a little later. We also interviewed and had conversations with key stakeholders, including attorneys, teachers, advocates, as well as House of Corrections staff from across Massachusetts. Now, I am not going to outline all of the education laws that apply to young people who find themselves incarcerated. That is a much longer presentation. However, I will say a couple of things here. First of all, the Massachusetts State's Constitution guarantees a free and thorough education. And the state has special education laws, which historically were the basis for the federal laws, which outline the state's obligation to provide special education services to children with disabilities, including students in institutional settings. And that DESE has some specific responsibilities for those students. Under federal law, the main one being the IDEA, students detained or incarcerated have the same right to receive high quality education as non-incarcerated students up until a student's 22nd birthday. That's really important here. We're focusing today on 18 to 21-year-olds, some of whom are at Department of Youth Services, if incarcerated, in the juvenile system, and some of whom are at the House of Corrections and Department of Corrections. But these educational rights, the special education rights, continue until a young person's 22nd birthday, if they haven't yet graduated from high school. And there's a quote here on the slide from the US Department of Education, basically saying that all IDEA protections apply to students with disabilities in correctional facilities, and that the fact that a student has been charged or convicted of a crime does not diminish his or her substantive rights or the procedural safeguards and remedies under the IDEA. Last thing I'll say before the next slide is that the majority of students who are enrolled in Massachusetts in public high schools who are aged at least 19, 20, and 21 are those with an IEP in place. They do have an IEP. They're receiving special education services, or should be anyway. Okay, on to the findings, of which there are 6. The first finding is that there are a lot of agencies involved and not enough accountability. So no single agency basically is taking ultimate responsibility to ensure that incarcerated 18 to 21-year-olds, especially those with disabilities, receive the education to which they're entitled. Now, DESE is the agency that under federal law and under state law does have an obligation to assure the delivery of these services. But DESE, in the regulatory structure, delegates a lot of these duties both to local school districts that are typically not acting unless there's an attorney present. And also, importantly, as we'll see in finding 2, they delegate the identification of youth with IEPs to the houses of correction, those at houses of correction. So for a young person who's at the House of Correction, a young person with an IEP, there are a lot of actors going on, and each of them has a small role in education. The House of Correction, or DOC or DYS, has an obligation to, under the regulatory structure, to identify the educational level, and if they have an IEP, to tell DESE about that. Give the young person the option to opt into those services and tell DESE about that. Now, DESE has an obligation to liaise with school districts and to arrange the special education services. I mentioned already CES, the Collaborative for Educational Services, which is a private nonprofit entity in Massachusetts that has contracts from DESE to provide special education services to those at House of Correction. They also have contracts from DYS to provide non-special educational services at DYS. And so these are the people who are hiring and providing special education teachers. And finally, the school districts still have some responsibility, at least under the DESE regs, for paying for an incarcerated student's special education services. But as we'll see later, it doesn't happen a lot of the time. School districts are largely absent. In sum, there is no single actor that has enough of a role to say, look, the buck stops here, and to take accountability for the fact that very few students who are incarcerated, or young people who are incarcerated with IEPs, are actually receiving those services. Okay, the second finding is that houses of corrections are massively under-identifying young people in their care who have existing IEPs. This is, I think, the key finding that comes as a result of our data requests. And if you remember one thing from this presentation, I want it to be this chart. So I'll do my best to explain it. I know there are a lot of colors going on. So as I mentioned, CFJJ put in a number of public records requests. Not all of the houses of corrections responded. Not all of them, some of them responded asking for a large amount of money. But from those who did respond, we were able to create an estimate, and that's what we have in blue, of the average number monthly of 18 to 21-year-olds, all 18 to 21-year-olds in House of Correction custody. So in 2018, about 450, 2019, 419, and 2020, 325. That is a trend down in line with trends, national trends and statewide trends in both the adult and juvenile system. So this is how many 18 to 21-year-olds are in House of Correction custody in any 1 month as an average across all of the houses of correction across the state. Now, the green provides a model based on the 51% of young people who have an IEP within the DYS population. We'll talk about DYS in some depth later, but just to say, at DYS, a little more than 50% of the young people in their care and custody, including 18 to 20-year-olds, have an IEP in place and are receiving special education services. And the yellow is a model assuming that 38% of individuals have an IEP. There's a study from Northeastern University based on House of Corrections survey, either last year or the year before. It was published last year. And 38% of the respondents said that they had an IEP at one time. That's not just a survey of 18 to 21-year-olds, but that just provided a benchmark here. So we have overall population in blue, green and yellow, two different models. And in red, we have the actual number of individuals age 18 to 21 that houses of corrections have identified as having an IEP. This is a real number. This comes from DESE's own data. And so the key thing here is this gap between red and yellow, or red and green statewide. We would expect to see a much higher number based on these assumptions, based on these other models, that young people in House of Correction custody, almost half of them, 18, 21-year-olds, assuming they're similarly situated as the youth in DYS, which is our assumption here, would have an IEP in place. But this really tiny number is actually happening, getting identified. So the question then becomes why? Why is that? Well, I'll come to a few of the theories a little bit later, but there is a important thing to say, which is that the House of Corrections that have the obligation to identify young people with IEPs and bring that to the attention of DESE, the methods of identifying are woefully inadequate. They rely on self-reporting from the people themselves, the young people themselves, sometimes in education intake forms, sometimes in monthly meetings. So a young person can be sitting for a few weeks, up to 3 or 4 weeks before they're even asked this question at a monthly meeting, whether they have an IEP, and sometimes are even sort of expected to raise their hand in a group and say, yeah, I have an IEP in place. There are also incentives in place for young people and all people at Houses of Correction to engage in work programs because they can get good time off. And those incentive programs don't exist for education or aren't as robust for education. Overall, this is a system that does not prioritize education for young people in its care. And it's a reflection of the system orientation at the Houses of Correction, as well as the DOC. So again, the key thing is this gap between red, the actual number of people identified with IEPs, and something close to what we would expect based on what we see at DYS and what we see from an HOC survey. I know there's a lot of data in here, so I'm going to encourage you to download the full report and really dive into this yourselves. It's important that to say that there are differences, and while there are these under-identifications in general, there are differences between different counties. So Berkshire is actually pretty much meeting our expectations, and Franklin is pretty close, at least in 2018 and 2019, both with small numbers overall of young people because they're smaller counties. However, at Middlesex, Norfolk, Plymouth, and Worcester, we see very large gaps, and even Norfolk does not have any young people receiving special educational services from 2018, 2019, and 2020. I know there are more than 6 counties in Massachusetts. Again, the data here is from the counties that I will say reasonably responded to our public records requests. If other counties want to share their data without charging exorbitant fees, I welcome. Okay, the third finding is that the Department of Corrections is also under-identifying a significant number of young people with IEPs. DOC reported, and these numbers are a little hard to present, at least as a percentage here, but DOC reported that of the 346 incarcerated people aged 18 to 21 who were enrolled in some school over the 4-year period from 2017 to 2021, only 2 had been identified as needing and receiving special educational services over a 2.5-year period. So I acknowledge there's different time periods, 4 years versus 2.5 years. But to say that out of possible hundreds of people who are incarcerated at DOC, and our estimates here, again, the same green and yellow are the same estimates based on even those who are at school in that age group, only 2 received services overall. So just to put some numbers to that, we can estimate that DOC likely failed to provide a free and appropriate public education, FAPE, which is the language from IDEA, the federal statute, to 176 youth in custody between that time period, between 2018 and 2020. At the same time, staying with DOC for a moment, DOC has people on waiting lists for educational services. At the end of December, there were more than 6,000 people in DOC custody. There were 6,000 people in DOC custody, and only 886, just under 15%, were enrolled in some educational classes, yet more than 4,000 were on waiting lists for adult basic education, ABE, as well as adult secondary education. So it's important to note that DOC invests less than 2% of its budgets on all program costs, that's inclusive of education costs. There's a huge unmet demand for educational programming at DOC. And since DESE is available and can provide teachers, special education teachers for those who can qualify for it, DOC and HOC are missing an opportunity here to have more teachers available for young people who need it and who have a right to it. Just to mention that DOC also has large issues, major mental health problems within its population. And almost 30% of those incarcerated DOC facilities have a serious mental health issue identified in the year 2021. And that DOC facilities have the 4th highest suicide rate in the nation. So I just wanted to say there are some reasons given in discussions with people about why these numbers are so low in terms of the number of people with IEPs who are under-identified. And I wanted to just mention some of those reasons and also respond to them with a few thoughts. One thing that's brought up is that the correctional schedule is just too busy, that there isn't enough time to prioritize education. As one former HOC education director said, look, this is a correctional facility, and that safety and well-run facility comes first, and the other stuff follows. That visits, medical, even sometimes locking people up for food, lawyer time, religious services, treatment, that a young person can get in trouble and isn't allowed to go to programming for 10 days, and that there are lockdowns. So my response to this is really that this gets to the heart of this issue around the culture at adult correctional facilities, and that the culture of these institutions is punitive, that HOCs and DOC are regularly putting young people in their care and custody into solitary confinement, not a term that these facilities like to use. They sometimes call things security segregation or use other euphemisms. But this education is simply not prioritized. At the same time, at the Department of Youth Services, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, they have figured out a way to prioritize education and provide 5.5 hours per day as a default for all of the people in their care of education. And if they qualify for special education, then for special education services. This, I'll mention a couple of other critiques. One is that HOC and DOC are simply set up for older people. They use the term inmates, not one that I subscribe to. And again, a former HOC education director mentioned that HOCs are usually geared to people who are much older, for people in their 30s. Spoiler alert for one of our recommendations, and you will not be surprised to hear this if you've been following Citizens for Juvenile Justice. This is just crying out as yet another reason to raise the age of juvenile jurisdiction to include at least 18 to 20-year-olds in the juvenile court, and if not, to purposely change the culture of these adult correctional facilities for young people who are incarcerated to have the default be at least 5.5 hours of school. Let's really prioritize education for young people. It was sometimes, someone mentioned in discussions that young people don't want the bad attention associated with being identified as having an IEP, and that they could refuse services because they don't want to draw attention to themselves. So in addition to, my response would be, in addition to blaming potential recipients of a service that they're not getting and to which they are have a legal right to, this is really an institutional problem that can be changed if the institutions wanted to. If the services are provided to, as I mentioned, the estimated 50% of youth who likely qualify, then it's normalized. It's not going to be a question of having drawing attention to yourself, because it will be a normal situation. Okay, finding 4 is that DESE, the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, the state education agency, fails to ensure that youth at the HOC and DOC facilities receive the educational services and the special educational services to which they are legally entitled. Now, I already mentioned that state and federal special education law place the responsibility to provide free and appropriate education for youth aged 18 to 21 with existing IEPs, even those who are incarcerated, on DESE. But DESE has delegated that duty primarily to multiple other actors, including the House of Corrections to identify who has an IEP in place, including CES, in this case, or it could be another contracted provider, but a private contracted provider to actually provide the special educational services, and to school districts to pay when necessary. In sum, this doesn't work. We saw those numbers in findings 2 and 3, but because of DESE's regulatory regime, because it's passing the responsibility to other actors, DESE does not feel accountable for this failure. They can just say, well, it's these other actors. We've set up a regulatory structure that these other actors are responsible for, and they are not fulfilling their mandate. DESE is also failing to maintain the level of oversight necessary to hold these other actors accountable. So this leaves an estimated 189 youth per year with existing IEPs at HOCs, an additional 176 youth at DOC over that 3-year time frame. So these are young people. These are the number of young people who are missing special educational services by our estimates each year. So taking together, this means that DESE's regime is not enough oversight, pushing the responsibility to identify youth on HOCs and to the young people themselves, and pushes this fiscal and programmatic responsibility onto school districts. Now, in our discussions with DESE, it seems that their conceptualization of their role for these young people is to oversee the contract that they have with CES. They do have a contract to provide services, and to try to hold school districts accountable. DESE largely works with school districts and has some sway over school districts. But school districts are, as we'll see in the next finding, very rarely held responsible and very rarely contacted. DESE's own guidance to the House of Correction sets up a process to note which school districts are unresponsive to requests. And while we requested these records from DESE, there were none. That's probably not because the districts are being really responsive. I think it's because DESE's oversight of the districts is just lacking in this regard. All right, I do want to talk about DYS briefly. And finding 5 is that DYS is meeting more of its legal obligations to provide educational services to children and young adults than the HOCs and DOC. As I mentioned already, the 51%, we sort of took the middle ground. This is from DYS data from 2017 to 2020 that shows between 48 and 55% of youth, both in detention admissions and their commitments, that's post-adjudication, have an IEP in place. Now, DYS's orientation, its system orientation, requires that all individuals within the custody receive some level of education, while the HOCs and DOCs do not. Those in DYS custody may also be required to receive mental health evaluations and participate in other programs designed to develop more responsible behaviors. Now, the HOCs and DOC may have some programs, but DYS is doing this in addition to the 5.5 hours a day of school. Now, in one of the key findings above was around identification of youth, that the HOCs were doing HOCs and DOC were doing a particularly poor job of identifying which youth already have an IEP in place. And DYS has figured this out. And they figured this out with a data sharing mechanism, a memorandum of understanding between DESE and DYS, which shares data between these agencies and lets DYS know, I believe the sharing happens twice a week, although DYS could confirm that. But it lets them know on a very regular basis which people in their custody have an IEP in place so that they can immediately start the special education services or the process to get those services started right away. So we know it's possible for DESE to share this data and to work in an interagency way. And DYS has figured that out. And the HOCs could figure that out, as could DOC, but they're not. And we see this as possible. A couple of notes about DYS's caseload, that the average age in calendar year 2021 of youth who are committed to DYS was 17.8 years. So in other words, almost half of youth committed at DYS are above age 18. They're 18 to 20. This is the same age cohort that we're talking about for those at HOCs. At DYS, they're getting school 5.5 hours a day. And at HOCs and DOC, the numbers are only a tiny fraction are. In addition, and as well as saying that only a tiny fraction of those who have an IEP in place are receiving those services. So at DYS, it is the default to have school 5.5 hours a day, Monday through Friday, and that they offer the MCAS testing at DYS facilities, and that they also offer school credits, high school credit, as well as high school diplomas and HiSETs at DYS. The HOCs and DOC, there's no way to receive high school credit. You can get a HiSET, but there's no high school actual credit being given at the HOCs. DYS also has a college program in post-secondary. And importantly, DYS, one aspect and one program of DYS that we find is important to mention here is their YES program, Youth Engaged in Services, which is a voluntary program where young people who have aged out of DYS sign up to continue to receive support during the 6 months after their aging out of DYS, post-discharge. And they can still get case management services, transitional support, housing services, clinical services, and continued education, treatment, and job training. And I believe the most recent numbers were more than 60% of youth who are aging out of DYS or discharge are signing up voluntarily for this service. No such thing exists, to my knowledge, at the House of Correction or DOC. So to summarize here, the DYS versus the House of Correction and DOC, I'm not expecting you to read this very detailed chart, but it's again, look at the chart on page 17 in the report to take a look here. There are real differences in orientation and philosophy. At DYS, this orientation is towards positive youth development and supporting young people versus a punitive approach. DYS has a broader educational mandate and certainly expresses that the broader educational mandate than the HOCs and DOCs. We've seen that DYS is much better at identifying who in their care is eligible, who already has an IEP, and also better at delivering these special educational services to youth with IEPs. We still have a critique, by the way, of DYS. I think that they could still do a better job in providing all of the services on a young person's IEP, but as a baseline, they are providing 5.5 hours of school and including special educational services. DYS does not have a waiting list for educational services because, again, the default, they are ready and staffed to have all people in their care receive education. That's not the case for House of Correction and DOC. I should say the House of Correction waiting list, I think, depends county to county, and I don't have data on that right now. At DYS, high school credits and degrees can be granted, as well as taking the MCAS test. And finally, I'll just say that the public safety outcomes are better at DYS. The recidivism rate is 25% at DYS reconviction rate versus more than 65% reconviction rate at HOCs and DOCs. Okay, it wouldn't be fair to leave school districts completely out of this conversation. The school districts generally are also failing to provide support to older students who are incarcerated. And they're not really held account for this fact, and that young people should not be bearing the impact of the failure of these local and state actors to coordinate a system for their care. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip to the recommendations. There are 4 overarching recommendations. The first is to raise the age of juvenile court jurisdiction. The legislature should raise the age to include 18 to 20-year-olds, maybe also 21-year-olds in the future, in the juvenile court jurisdiction, in part because youth in DYS custody are more likely to access their educational rights and receive developmentally appropriate treatment. And for the same public safety reasons that I mentioned, there is a much lower recidivism rate, reconviction rate at for young people coming out of DYS than the adult correctional facilities in Massachusetts. The second recommendation is that in the meantime, while the legislature considers raising the age, that DESE, the House of Correction, and DOC should improve their interagency data sharing and improve identification of incarcerated youth with IEPs. This can be achieved through a matching of the names of students who have IEPs in place, the same way that DESE does this already with DYS. So there is legal precedent and practical precedent for such data sharing. DESE should also strengthen its oversight broadly at the House of Correction and DOC. Some of those specific recommendations would include working closer with House of Correction education directors and the DOC Education Department to implement identification procedures to quickly ID students who have IEPs, to lead the effort to establish data exchange, to take full responsibility for the provision of educational services directly to students at HOCs and DOC, right? So DESE should take this on and actually say, no, this is a failure. These low numbers are not simply because of other agencies' work. This is our responsibility. They should ensure that HOCs follow the DESE guidance that exists already and ensure that high school credit can be given to youth who attend classes at HOCs and DOCs. And ultimately, if HOCs and DOCs are not able to do this, that's another reason to raise the age. And we've seen that young people at DYS are able to get the services and education to which they are entitled. A recommendation is that HOCs and DOCs should create a dedicated education budget, which would be a reflection of an intentional orientation shift that prioritizes educational program for every young person in custody at DOC and HOCs. There are plenty of other ways for House of Correction and DOC to further prioritize education, to integrate needs assessment and planning into the intake process, to ensure that education is not limited by classification or housing status, to evaluate teacher training and staffing levels, as well as curriculum development, to ensure that youth can receive high school credit towards graduation from their home school district, to coordinate the curriculum, and also to increase access to higher education in both adult jails and prison. Finally, as I mentioned, the data that I have is partial. And I would recommend, CFJJ does recommend, that the Office of the State Auditor take a look at this and consider an investigation of these obligations and these practices. To their credit, they have looked at CES recently and made some findings there, but I have not seen anything specifically looking at these young people here. 18 to 21-year-olds at House of Corrections and DOC. So, in conclusion, despite the state and federal laws in place that should ensure that all young people up to their 22nd birthday receive fair and appropriate public education, 18 to 21-year-olds incarcerated in the adult system in Massachusetts have significant barriers and are not receiving programs and services to which they have a right. There are ways to improve this program, to improve this work. The easiest, I think, to really take care of it would be raising the age of juvenile jurisdiction. And I want to thank you for your time today. Our report is live, and CFJJ is ready to answer any other questions that come up. First, we have a group of panelists. So back to you, Leon.
Thank you so much, Josh, for that detailed presentation. We will now introduce our distinguished panel. We're lucky today to have both an expert on education in youth carceral settings and an experienced education law attorney for system-involved youth, including those in carceral settings, with us today. First, I'm honored to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Lynette Tannis. Dr. Tannis began her education career more than 2 decades ago and has served in a myriad of educational roles, including as a teacher, coach, literacy coordinator, school district administrator, professional developer, researcher, lecturer, education consultant, and an education delegate throughout the United States and within 5 continents: Africa, Asia, Europe, North America, and South America. She is the author of Educating Incarcerated Youth, Exploring the Impact of Relationships, Expectations, Resources, and Accountability, and is recognized as a juvenile justice education expert and an expert on school leadership and literacy. So without further ado, to talk about CFJJ's report and our findings, I introduce to you Dr. Lynette Tannis. Good afternoon, Doctor.
Thank you so much, Leon. Thank you very much for that introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. And Josh, I just want to say a special thank you to you and the CFJJ team for this important research that is much needed in this field. Our juvenile justice courts were established in 1899. They were established because they recognized there's a difference between children and adults. And yet, with more than 1.1 million cases heard across our juvenile justice courts each year, there's an automatic 200,000 cases that are automatically waived to adult courts. And so I just want to make a few comments based on the findings from the report and some of the recommendations. I can't help but think of Frederick Douglass's Blessings of Liberty and Education address that he gave in Manassas, Virginia in 1894. He stated that a man without education is as a poor prisoner without hope. And he went on to state that education means emancipation. And so I also think it's really important that, as you shared earlier, Josh, we know in these spaces, it is about punishment. Safety and security definitely becomes the priority. Education is more seen as a privilege and not as a right. And so because of that sort of idea that education means emancipation or freedom, I do believe this is why in so many spaces, we tend not to, society, this is actually happening in the United States of America, and unfortunately in other places around the world, yes, there in Massachusetts as well, we don't always focus on education as a priority, as that tool that was mentioned earlier to unlock so much for the individuals and for the communities and society as well. In 2011, Reed and O'Cummings, they did a research study. At the time, there were about 2,700 juvenile facilities within the United States. And it was determined that only 65% of the facilities were offering an educational program for all of its incarcerated youth. That same year, they surveyed children with IEPs, individualized education programs, and it was determined that only 46% of those children actually said, yes, we are receiving the services to which we are entitled. And so, yes, there is this, again, recommendation that we at least are providing more, perhaps offering more for children in the DYS compared to the adult programs. That is true. All of the research also shows that, as you said earlier, Josh, there is far more, unfortunately, but far more sexual assaults that happen when children are placed in adult facilities, as well as the suicide attempts. So these are grave issues, in addition to having less exposure to education. When I graduated in 2013 with my doctorate in education, and again, focused on juvenile justice, I wanted to help in any way possible. And I ended up actually supporting an organization in New Jersey. And so I was pleased to see New Jersey represented in the report to show the progress that's being made there. At the time, this organization was really committed to helping to ensure the 74 children at the time in adult prisons were no longer placed there. And I started reaching out to some of them, and there was one gentleman in particular I'll just mention. He was arrested and now charged as an adult at age 16. For his own protection, Josh, as you mentioned earlier, there's so many titles that we give, but again, it is solitary confinement, no matter what the label is. He was placed in administrative segregation for 965 days, basically until he became an adult, to protect him. He was placed in solitary confinement. He was a special needs learner, and yet there was no one there to provide that support to him. And so it's so important, to the extent possible, that we can raise the age. In Oregon, there is a facility, the McLaurin Youth Correctional Facility, and they do allow youth, children, again, the science is, it's our brains don't fully develop until we're age 25. So this does also match up with the science, but not until they are able to be there through age 24. And so, you know, keeping those things in mind is really important as well. One last thing I will just share with you is I was working with a state a couple of years ago, actually in the height of the pandemic, again, recognizing that in some places, it really depends on who the provider is for the education. But in talking with some of the youth, one of the very first questions I asked them was, you know, regarding their IEP or if they had special needs. And two were eager to share with me, like, oh, miss, we did have one, but we don't have one now. And so I was like, okay, they were both kind of saying the same thing. I was like, what do you mean you don't have one now? Oh, when we arrived, they said, oh, it's different here because it's smaller classes, so you don't need one. And so what is also happening is, unfortunately, children are being sort of counseled out of even receiving the services to which they're entitled. We kind of continue to do what I am just going to say systems believe is more convenient instead of what's right. In the same address that Frederick Douglass gave, he did say that to deny any human being an education is one of our most greatest crimes. And so it's important that we do not continue to do one of our greatest crimes to those who have been accused or committed of crimes. And so my hope is that this report will help shed light and bring about the right change that needs to happen across Massachusetts children and the United States. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those pertinent words, Dr. Tanis. And I even had to chime in the chat because in my years as an attorney, absolutely, the issue of counseling out is something that I personally have seen over the years. We will now move on to our next panelist that we're happy to have with us, Attorney Elizabeth Levitan from the Ed Law Project. Attorney Levitan has worked at Ed Law since 2017, first as a Skadden Fellow and now as staff counsel. Elizabeth's work has focused on representing young people who are involved in the juvenile court system, as well as those who are incarcerated, including those who have special education issues. In addition to her direct representation of young people, Elizabeth advises and trains members of the Massachusetts Delinquency and Child Welfare Bar, parents and community members on special education and school discipline law, advocates for systemic reform to improve access to education for young people across Massachusetts. She's also active on several committees on educational advocacy, including the Education Law Task Force, the Alternatives to Discipline Subcommittee. She earned her Juris Doctor from the University of Pennsylvania Law School and her bachelor's degree from Haverford College. Elizabeth, we're so happy to have you. Welcome.
Thanks, Liam. And I'm very happy to be here. I wanted to use this time that I have to talk to sort of go through two different scenarios. One is for a young person who is arrested for conduct that happened the day before their 18th birthday, and one is the experience of a young person who is arrested for conduct that happened the day after their 18th birthday, and sort of discuss the differences in what their experience might be with their education in those two scenarios. The first thing I wanted to mention is, as a reminder to everybody, DYS frequently works with young people up to age 21. This can happen in a number of scenarios. One is if a young person is adjudicated delinquent, which is what we call it in juvenile court, for conduct that happened before their 18th birthday, but is not actually adjudicated until after. They can be committed to the Department of Youth Services through their 19th birthday. The other way is if a young person is charged with a certain type of crime, certain conduct through the youthful offender statute, they could be committed to DYS up until age 21. So there is, as Josh mentioned, a lot of young people in DYS who are over the age of 18, and it is an institution that is very used to working with young people in that age cohort. And I have also worked with a number of folks in that age cohort who have bounced back and forth between houses correction and DYS, which is always very challenging because the experience and the supports you get in DYS and what you experience in HOCs is vastly different. So for scenario number one, young person is arrested for conduct that took place the day before their 18th birthday. They are then adjudicated delinquent. Let's just go there to make it easy. They will be brought into DYS. They will go through an assessment period. During this assessment period, they will attend school automatically, assuming that they are in high school. Let's say this young person also has an IEP. DYS will reach out to the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, and through this data sharing agreement that Josh mentioned, there will be a opportunity for them to quickly identify the young person as someone with an IEP. Then the Department of Education will reach out, or DYS will reach out to the school district, obtain that IEP, review the IEP with the special education service provider, identify any services that they cannot provide, and send a letter to the school district to request that an IEP meeting be convened to discuss any services be provided that the system can't provide. This is not a perfect structure, because what often happens is everybody comes together. Some services are provided by DESE/SCIS. Some services need to be provided by the school district. Dr. Tanis mentioned counseling out. That happens very frequently, but you will fairly quickly and with a coherent structure get an IEP meeting together that involves all relevant players to discuss what the student needs. And in the meantime, they will be in school. I would also note that DYS has very good structures for ensuring that young people get credit for the work that they do while in DYS. And I've been to a number of graduation ceremonies at DYS for kids who have obtained their high school diploma during this time. And as I believe Josh mentioned, many young people in this age cohort will sort of eventually, quote unquote, age out of criminalized conduct. And those big milestones in a young person's life, like a high school graduation, are a huge factor in helping young people move forward with their lives and mature and age out of some of this conduct. So that's what will happen for a young person who is arrested and charged with conduct that, charged for conduct that occurred the day before their 18th birthday. The second scenario is a young person who is arrested for conduct that occurred the day after their 18th birthday. And for the sake of simplicity, let's just assume that they are immediately brought into custody. And so they will come into custody, and I will caveat, one of the challenges is that each of the HOC systems is county-based, so they vary. So this cannot be a scenario that will apply to every single county, but this is sort of a general overview. But for example, a young person might come into custody. They might sit for a month before they receive a letter or attend a meeting in which they are told that if they were on an IEP before, they may have the right to special education services. Now, ideally, this is happening through a conversation. It may happen through a letter that is provided to that young person. The language in these letters varies significantly in terms of how comprehensible it is. If that young person is able to say, and it feels comfortable saying, yes, I was on an IEP, they will then receive a form that is written by DESE. That's a consent form for school-aged inmates that goes through a list of different qualifications they have to agree to and then sign off on before they even begin the process of getting their services. And the language in this agreement is really high level, which is also potentially problematic when you take into account that I believe the report mentioned that up to 53% of folks in adult facilities may be struggling with a learning disability and may not be reading at the high school or beyond level that this document is written at. So a young person has to check off all of the boxes, sign it. I will also note that some of the information in the boxes is arguably inaccurate. For example, it makes it sound as if a district could refuse to provide special education services to an eligible student. That is not accurate. And then the young person will wait for somebody to contact SEIS, and eventually maybe somebody will come in once a week and work with them on English and math at best. There are very rarely any opportunities for history, science, or social studies. There are very rarely any opportunities for those credits to be transferred over, meaning that they're not actually working towards their high school education or diploma. And there are very often challenges with getting the school district in who are supposed to be providing any additional services. So for example, if that young person may have had speech and language services in their IEP, those won't be provided unless the school district comes in, and that is not happening with any frequency. So we're talking about a 2-day difference or 3-day difference in an event in a young person's life and dramatically differing consequences. So that's sort of the overview that I wanted to give. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Much appreciated. We are now going to transition into our question and answer segment of the day's program. If you have a question, you may type it into the chat or use the raise hand option under the participants tab, and we will then call on you and then direct your question to a member of our panel. If you're joining today by phone, you can mute and unmute yourself by pressing *6, and you can raise your hand by pressing *9 on your phone. So any questions? Well, I will start by looking in the chat, and I see Kathleen Bettetti posted a link to an previous audit done regarding some issues with education and DYS, only to say that we're not suggesting in this report that there are no issues with DYS. We are simply using a comparison to say DYS does offer at least this certain standard of education, and that our adult correctional facilities fall far short of that. But I do encourage you all to not only read our report, but to read the link in the chat just for the full breadth of information. So any questions, or did Josh and our panel do such an amazing, phenomenal, comprehensive job that everyone is just so crystal clear on all of the issues? Yes, Soledad, please go ahead.
Can you hear me? Thank you. No, I just wanted to thank you and CFJJ just for full disclosure. My name is Soledad Valenciano and I'm board president for CFJJ. And I commend the report. And I just wanted to make a comment as someone that works with incarcerated youth. The other benefit, if there is a benefit to being a DYS, is that the youth and his or her family can get involved. And so the family is a big part of this as well to the success. They have a lot of information that is often very useful in determining the history of the child's education, the youth's education, and something that is lost once you enter the adult system, because by the nature of it, you are treated as an adult. And so again, the benefit to treating these young people and keeping them within the juvenile justice system is that you have the involvement of the families. And again, pivotal to knowing the history, which, as was mentioned earlier, a lot of these young people don't know. They don't know what has happened in their lives. They for a number of reasons, are not as engaged or don't understand it fully. And so that was going to be just a point that I wanted to raise, the benefit of having the family engagement. Thank you.
Thank you, Soledad. Quickly, a comment in the chat that I would like to uplift from Yvonne Gittleson, who states, I work at an HOC and now I work at DESE, and this report is 100% accurate in my opinion. There's no prioritizing of these services for young people who are incarcerated. Thank you so much for your comment, Yvonne. Our next question comes from Andrea Parker. Andrea, go ahead.
Hi there. Thank you all so much. I wanted to first ask a technical question. Where is this report available? Is there a link to that as well, the report that came out today?
Yes, so if you scroll up, there's a link that has been dropped in the chat where you can go to a website where the report is available to download. And Senna, right on point, has just dropped that in the chat again.
Thank you. And then Mike, I really wanted to thank Elizabeth for uplifting this. I think it was Elizabeth, or was that Dr. Tanis, that uplifted this change, you know, in what happens before the 18th birthday and after the 18th birthday. At the Federation for Children with Special Needs, we run a project where children under the age of 18 in DCF and DYS custody have access to a special education surrogate parent, which is basically an education decision maker, and then that immediately stops at their 18th birthday. So if you all have ideas or ways that forums where we could participate to also advocate that continue beyond the 18th on birthday, because again, this sometimes happens in the middle before they've even graduated. So yeah, I just wanted to share that and ask that question.
Thank you so much, Andrea. Our next question comes from Michelle. Go ahead.
Hi, I might have missed this and I'm sorry if I did, but who oversees DESE? Who are they accountable to? Do they have audits?
Sure. I mean, DESE is one of the departments of the executive branch of the Massachusetts state government. You know, I'd say they're all accountable to the governor, and the governor is accountable to all of us through elections. And yes, they are subject to audits. The Office of the State Auditor has the jurisdiction or the legal authority to audit any of the executive branch members. In theory, they could be subject to federal oversight as well, but that was not one of our recommendations. I also want to go back to Andrew's question. Elizabeth, do you have any ideas to respond to that?
Sure. So Andrea, you were talking about the CES program specifically. So I think one of the challenges with that program is when the young person turns 18, even if they're still in school, it's really up to them if they want to continue with the outside education decision maker or if they want to become their own decision maker. I believe, and I have had young people shared decision making with CESP if they had a good relationship with them, but I'm not sure, actually, you may have insight into whether or not that's sort of supported more broadly, or if those are just sort of strange experiences that I had. But I think it's it's a really useful support structure for a lot of young people. And, I think it's an important thing to discuss is how do we make sure that young people have the support they need in making their own educational decisions or handling the IEP process once they turn 18, for sure. I don't know if that answers your question.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And Elizabeth, I'm going to keep you in the spotlight, directing a question from the chat from Candace, who asked, does the HOC and DOC honor or engage families in the process like DYS? Is there a release that can be signed for over 18?
So in my experience with young people in DYS or in HOCs, there has not been much family involvement in those conversations around education. The young person is over 18, so technically they are an adult. That does not mean that they are developmentally an adult, and often it is incredibly helpful to have a young person's family involved. But without some kind of support structure in place to reach out to the family and bring them into the conversation, it's not happening by default. And I would note that the IEP meetings aren't happening by default. So it's not even getting to the level of having something to invite family to in most scenarios. Versus in DYS, there is a automatic process of reaching out to families and building those relationships. So we are not seeing that.
Absolutely. And just to add on to that, in my years having practiced both in the juvenile and the adult system, when people ask about family engagement, I always say in DYS, it's a mother or father sitting next to their child and talking to their child and can give their child a hug, versus in the adult system, you're sitting there and you're talking through a phone. And that distinction makes a huge difference developmentally for young people. The next question, and I'll open this up to Josh or anyone on our panel, from Jazz Marie Williams, who asks, I haven't had a chance to look through the report, but does the report speak to the pipeline from school discipline and suspensions to incarceration?
Thanks so much for that important question, Jazz. The report doesn't talk specifically about the school to prison pipeline because we're focused in this report on young people who are already incarcerated, so are already sort of deeper end in the system involvement. That said, in the discussion of school districts, we do have a section talking about racial disparities around school discipline and arrest, and we highlight that this is not the young people going to DYS is not equally distributed throughout the state, that there are certain schools and districts and municipalities that are sending a lot more young people to DYS than others. And I've just dropped another report in the chat, CFJJ's FAIL report, which focuses on policing in schools. So we are very interested in that question, though it was not highlighted too much in this report, but thanks so much for uplifting it.
Yes, thank you. It's a great question. One other comment in the chat I'd like to uplift again from Yvonne, who states, to the previous question, I'm the corrections program specialist for DESE, and no, families are not invited to support their student inside either at HOCs or DOCs. So from one of our attendees, a direct answer to that question. So wonderful questions. Just want to make sure, are there any other questions that we have either for Josh, who's our lead author, or for either of our wonderful panelists?
Go ahead, Michelle.
I apologize. I'm still on this, and I'm happy to go offline if I need to, but those meetings with the families, is that is that something that they're supposed to be doing and they're just not? Or is it optional? Just who are they who's holding them accountable to the things that are already things that they're supposed to be doing?
I mean, it's such a fabulous question, right? Because we highlight that agencies might not be fulfilling their mandate fully, or possibly fulfilling all of the legal obligations, or certainly fulfilling their moral obligations to care for young people. And we say it, and so why do we say it, right? It's sort of like, you know, the so what question. Why do we put this out here? Well, I mean, ultimately, the fact that that meetings are not taking place and that young people are not receiving the education that they have a right to, it falls on all of the agencies involved, falls on the leadership, the staff at the agencies, the leadership at those agencies. And it's, you know, part of what our role is to bring this to light and help hold them to account. There are a lot of different ways to make social change. You know, if things are not being done in a manner that is legal, that is fulfilling their rights, then, you know, then they're potentially opening themselves up to litigation. That's one way to do it. Our first two recommendations are to the legislature, who has the authority to define juvenile court jurisdiction. It is currently defined for anyone for acts up to an 18th birthday. But they could look at this, and we hope that they do. And this is one of many arguments that we believe are convincing to raise the upper age of juvenile jurisdiction, right? That is within the legislature's authority, and Vermont did it a couple of years ago. And there are ample reasons, the education being, for us, the most, the one we're highlighting in this report, but there are a lot of other reasons. The brain science was mentioned, and really the system orientation, it makes a difference for the experience of young people. Since I'm talking, I'll just say, I see there's a question from Noor. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Josh. Thank you for the presentation. It was really important. I'm wondering, so you made recommendations on sort of the policy and programmatic end. I'm wondering what your recommendations are beyond getting more comprehensive data from all the counties, what your recommendations are from a research perspective. So what do you think is the sort of next question that we should be asking here?
Sure. I mean, I think that there are opportunities to really look at I'd say a broader, you know, I mentioned recidivism a few times, but let's really look at the longer term life outcomes, right? And if to document what it means that, you know, our juvenile system and DYS is at least on paper and through some of its actions, taking on a positive youth development approach. All right, so what are the things we care about for young people? If we say we care about them being educated and meeting, you know, job ready and engaging in the economy and having caring relationships with adults, and then, like, do our agencies track that? Right, so that, you know, are these the things? If we say we care about that, does our system working in coordination to take a look at that? And, you know, there is some data out there, and so that's where I would look, you know, to really look in depth and to get that data and do even more of a comparison. If we, you know, the concept of this report is you have 18 to 20-year-olds, both the DYS and at the Houses of Corrections and DOC. So, you know, I don't want to say that there are some differences in that population, but are they similarly situated enough to really look at the impacts of what it means to be treated in the juvenile court versus the adult court, and all of the institutions that fall under that. So that's my idea, but I'd love to hear other research ideas from our panelists or Leon or Senna. Thanks for the question, Nor.
Well stated, Josh, well stated. Other questions, other comments, other feedback? I'll quickly just uplift something that Josh said. When we look at this issue, there's certainly the moral obligation to young people. And, you know, if we truly talk about wanting young people to transition into a successful adulthood, then we have to back that up by genuinely prioritizing their education. But even for those who don't feel that moral imperative, this is a legal issue. These are legal rights that young people have that are not being met and that are not being followed. And that's the true complexity of this issue. It's something that we should do because it's the right thing, but it also needs to happen because they have these rights. And that's the report definitely navigates and brings both of those elements into it. Right. One last go of it. Any further questions? Hearing none. I just want to quickly again reiterate, we've placed a link in the chat. The website is live. Please go, please download the report. Please share the report far and wide. This is a very important issue impacting our young people. We want to bring it into the light and we want to make sure as many people as possible know about it. So please share. Additionally, if you do not already, please follow CFJJ on your social media. We are at CFJJMA on Twitter and Instagram, and at Citizens for Juvenile Justice on Facebook. You will also be able to access, you know, today's recording. You'll be able to access the report itself, and in general, a number of posts and information about key youth justice issues there. Lastly, any questions that you think of after this, please do not hesitate to reach out to us via email at cfjj@cfjj.org. And with that being said, I want to thank you all again so much just for your support and for being here. And I wish you all a wonderful rest of your day.